wasn't until I was in the SEAL teams that it dawned on me that anybody can apply, civilian, military, whatever. And that's when I was probably 25 or 26 when I realized what the process was and how do you do it. I like doing active operational things and seeing spacewalks and people sitting in capsules of a spaceship. It all seemed very intriguing to me, and hands-on, kind of actively doing stuff, and that appealed to me as a job. And then the cool factor of going to space was a draw as well. I thought it'd be pretty neat.
This is Mission Control Houston. Endeavor's roll maneuver is being completed.
And then I learned more about the job, and there's way more to it than just going to space. I mean, I've been here for 17 years, and only 1 year of that has been in space. So we do a lot of other stuff supporting space in general, and I like that part too.
Cassidy also had insight on which process was tougher, joining the SEALs or becoming an astronaut, and how his military career has helped him at NASA.
The instructors don't want you to become a Navy SEAL until you graduate. Once I got selected to be an astronaut, the instructors wanted me to be an astronaut. They weren't trying to kick me out. So it's a different mindset. And it's obviously way more physical, the entry-level training to become a SEAL than it is to be an astronaut. And I would say it's more academic once you get selected as an astronaut to learn how to become an astronaut. It's more like graduate school. So it's really apples to oranges. And I think that when I was a young person right out of college, I was eager and ready for that hard physical challenge of SEAL training. Now is a little bit later in life, very happy that I'm not doing push-ups all day long with sand in my face. My training and background as a military person absolutely helped me. Talking on the radio, thinking about problems 2 or 3 steps in advance. What am I going to do if this happens? Assessing what your mission is, what the objective is, and then what are the risks of each step of it, and determining your decisions based on that. That was all something that was ingrained in me from my military background, and we do that exact same thing here.
And if there's someone who knows a few things about harrowing moments, Cassidy is certainly one. He talked about one of the scariest experiences he's had in space.
In my NASA work, hands down the most intense time was on a spacewalk 7 years ago with my partner, Luca, had water leaking into his helmet, which in space we don't want water in our helmets.
I see beads of sweat. No, it's not sweat. No, it's not sweat.
Hey, Luca, can you clarify, is it increasing or not increasing?
It's hard to tell, but it feels like a lot of water.
That was a big deal, and we got everything back in safely, and he was fine, and it was a lot of learning for the NASA engineers and for the astronauts to figure out why the water was there and how it happened. But in the moment, as it was happening, and we were outside the space station going around Earth 5 miles a second and still had 40 minutes to get back inside, that was a pretty intense time frame.
I feel a lot of water on the back of my head, but I don't think it speaks from my back. Are you sweating? You working hard? Yeah, I'm sweating, but it feels like a lot of water. Where's it coming from there? It's too much. I don't know. It's a lot. That's in my eyes.
So, Luca, we'll have you head back to the airlock. Chris, we'll get a plan for you to clean things up here and then join him here in a minute.
And then in the military deployments, much like other folks can with experiences in combat, different combat missions can be pretty intense.